Hello there, and welcome to Regulate Tech. This is the second episode of 2022, and we are going to really speak in macro terms. This episode is devoted to the question about the tech-lash. What is it? Is it still a thing? Was it so 2021? What are the structures underlying it? What are the trends in it? How can we think about it as tech policy experts? Just generally getting a sense of it's almost like trying to figure out the vibe. What's the vibe in the public debate now? What do you think about the tech-lash, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, just going. Lots of people sort of rode in under or behind this banner. I think it was actually coined by The Economist originally, and I think it does capture something really quite profound, which is that historically, as it were, there was a sort of general assumption that a new technology coming into a sector was going to improve it. And technology sort of rode on the back of that notion for many years, and people would sort of question, the specifics of how a technology was being introduced. But I think there's underlying assumption that the new thing was better than the old thing was there. And the tech-lash, in a sense, sort of says, I mean, literally the sort of notion of a backlash is, well, now we've looked again at all of those claims you made, and we think the new thing is actually worse than the old thing. And that's really quite a profound and quite an extraordinary shift. And the classic example, I think, would be around news media. So perhaps no surprise that the term was coined by a news media outlet themselves. But, in news media, it's not just, people saying, well, this new digital stuff is sort of needs a little bit of trimming at the edges in order to be as good as the old kind of paper stuff that we had. It's much more saying, look, like internet technology driven news is almost like inherently worse and worse for society and kind of must be stopped in favor of a more traditional approach to news gathering and news distribution. So that's I think, a significant shift that we went from, let's say, a sort of almost underlying assumption that people like us who worked on the tech side of things could rely on to an extent, that look, bit of disruption along the way, but the new stuff is going to be better long run, to a position in which now people are actually saying quite seriously, look, the new stuff may be worse and maybe we need to not move forward in that direction at all, not innovate. We've got to kind of undo the innovation and go back to status quo ante.
Yeah, one way to think about this that occurs to me is that you could say that in different periods of history, the notion of social and technological progress have been synonymous. They've been tightly coupled. If you have technological progress, you're also going to get social progress. Technological progress underpins, drives, sort of supports social progress. And then there are other periods of history and time, and I think we're sort of in one of those periods now where the coupling between the two is really weak or even loose, so that social progress and technological progress are seen as not necessarily implying each other, and perhaps even, to your point, being inverse. So we can only get social progress if we slow down technological progress or even reverse it. I think that's really interesting. I think you're right to point to news media, because I do think that at some point, or at some level at least, speech is a really good example of this in most people's minds, where we used to think that if there's more speech, there's more democracy.
Yeah.
Right? More speech, more democracy. If you get tons of technology that produce tons of speech, you get more democracy. That thought, that the sort of relationship between speech and democracy is a linear one, I think is almost completely gone from the public debate now. I think that you're much more likely to find people who say that speech is good, but it depends on what speech, and it depends on how much, and it depends on who's speaking. And so there's like a qualification for the utility of speech in democracy that is also quite interesting to think about. And I think this decoupling of technological and social progress, this notion of more is not necessarily better, your point about the new thing not being better than the old thing, those are all components in the tech-lash that sort of lead to a much more critical perspective on technology that can be quite healthy, but can also end up being a sort of default assumption that technological progress erodes social progress.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, the way it's being framed is it's tech versus society. It's just almost literally framed that way. And people might qualify that and say, well, it's big tech. It's not all tech. We quite like the technology. We just don't like, the, however you want to use the acronym, the FANGs or the whatever acronym you use for these big companies, the Facebooks, the Apple. Oh, that could be MANGs now, hasn't it? Meta, Apple,
Oh,
Netflix,
you're right,
Google.
mangs.
Yeah. Anyway, so and actually, the biggest beast of them all, Microsoft, which we often don't talk about in the same way.
Yeah.
So there's some sort of crazy alphabet soup that involves several M's and A's and N's and G's. So people are saying, look, no, it's them in a sense that are against society, not tech. But I to a certain extent would question. I mean, I think some of the issues that people have, for example, around the ability of people to distribute what they regard as sort of fake news, false misinformation, however you want to describe it, but stuff that is socially damaging because it's outside of the sort of mainstream news narrative and is false and incorrect and misleading. That is actually a function of the technology. It's not a function of the big tech companies. It's a function of the internet and a small social media provider, any level, is just as capable of distributing that kind of content. So in a sense, I think it is tech v society, not just big tech v society. It's curious what you say about speech as being at the cutting edge. I heard somebody last week say, we can't call ourselves a democracy if fake news and misinformation is allowed to circulate freely. And I have to say, I thought, we can't call ourselves a democracy unless people are able to circulate fake news and misinformation to an extent. I mean, we can worry about it, but actually the definition of democracy is that the government doesn't control speech. The new, in a country where the news media are entirely controlled by government and people are not able to circulate anything else, I'd argue that isn't a democracy. So again, it's really interesting how far we've gone to the point where people can say, look, in order for us to declare ourselves a progressive society, a democracy, we have to clamp down on speech.
Yeah.
Really curious place that we sort of ended up.
And I think there are sort of two things in there that I'd like to unpick. The first is that I think you're right to make this distinction between technology company and technology. I actually think the tech-lash sort of operates on three different levels. So the first is our skepticism around technology at large. Is it really good for us? And that skepticism is not new. It dates back to Plato, saying that writing is not a good thing because people won't remember what they write, and if they don't remember, they will just parrot it, and that's not real wisdom. So that kind of skepticism around technology again comes and flows in ebbs and waves, and so I think that's one core part of it, and it's really interesting to think about the tech-lash against technology overall, because I think that's where we find some of the more interesting tensions about technology being so less, diminishing our human value, etc. And then there's like this other level, which is the technology industry, where you talk about, as you said, either it's an acronym or it's just the technology industry at large not paying their taxes, or it's the technology industry becoming too powerful, without quantifying power. And then it's the individual companies at the sort of third level, where you have a specific company that you don't like. You pick one out and you say that this company is far too large and is not treating its small customers in a good way, or this company is influencing the public. And it's important, if you're analyzing this as a policy person, you're thinking about, you have to figure out where in this hierarchy is your problem located. If what's happening here is really that people are increasingly skeptical of the ability of technology to sort of deepen our human values, or that it's some way sort of opposite to our human values, then that's a very different problem from people think you're doing the wrong thing as an industry or the wrong thing as a company. So orienting it is kind of, I think it's really important. I think, and the other thing to unpick and sort of to connect to, and what you say is this notion of we can't have a democracy with fake news. There's this other distinction that I find really interesting, that is you have your right to speech, but you don't have your right to reach.
Yeah.
And there's something in that I think really echoes of what you just said. If you have the right to speech, but you have no right to reach, what does that really mean? And why wouldn't you have the right to reach that's available to you? And how do you think about that? It's like there's this decoupling is so clear in that case, where sort of the social progress is speech, the technological progress is reach, and
Yes.
they're not the same, and we want one but we do not want the other. And it's that sort of decoupling acting on even in academic discourse in a really interesting way, I find.
Yeah, so there is a lot. I mean, again, arguably, you can say, well, we're still a democracy because people can say nonsense, misinformation, whatever they want to say. But we are going to, what we're doing, and actually, you look at the direction of the legislation, it's saying government wants to have more control over the levers of reach, over the technology companies, and that's explicit in the legislation that we're seeing coming forward in the UK's online safety bill and the EU's Digital Services Act. It's very clearly regulators wanting to get hold of the levers of reach, or at least have more say over them. It's usually under the banner of algorithms. We must be able to address the challenge around algorithms, but that is essentially a sort of reach intervention. And so I guess you can square it and say, look, in a democracy, people, it's still a democracy. We still got freedom of expression because people can say the nonsense, but we, the authorities, are going to intervene to make sure that we try and control how that nonsense gets out there and is read by other people, which itself has a whole range of issues, involved from a democratic perspective, also from a technical perspective, because often these algorithmic engines are working on signals that come from individuals choosing to share and distribute content. And now we're saying we're going to override those signals with some other criteria. Yeah, huge debate there, but it's an interesting space where the assumption, in a sense, original assumption was, we are in a much better place if we have more democratic media, in inverted commas, where individuals are choosing what rises to prominence, and the algorithms are based on that. That was the sort of revolutionary notion, the promise of all this technology. And we've kind of rode all the way back to say, well, no. There must be some kind of central control over what gets the reach, and that allowing, if I can describe it this way, too democratic, too open a mechanism for reach to be determined is actually harmful for society. And so we're sort of moving off in a different direction. But I'm just interested. I'm just thinking, as we're discussing, that there are perhaps two other technologies and technical revolutions that we sort of had in the past that might be interesting analogs here for us to think about. One is cars, where, I think we're in a phase now where we're saying that there's significant harm being caused by the internal combustion and automotive industry. But I'm not sure we'd go all the way back to saying, well, I wish, the 21st century, in a sense, was the century of the car, and the 22nd, or the internal combustion engine car, should be explicit. 22nd century is going to be the century in which we get rid of internal combustion engines for most purposes, and we move on to other forms of energy usage like electricity. And the argument there again is that this thing was great from one point of view, but from another point of view has caused incredible damage, potentially catastrophic damage to the planet. Interesting question. Would we go all the way back now and say, if only we'd stopped this technology of the internal combustion engine early on, we as society would have been in a much better place? I think that's one sort of interesting analog. The other one I think about is nuclear, where again, in nuclear, it's always delicate. We're comparing technology with nuclear industry, but in the nuclear industry, there was no doubt there were good and bad uses of nuclear, and the debate raged, didn't it, to say, could you have the good side of this new technology, which would be the power, without the bad side, which is both the waste that comes from the power generation, but also very, very acutely the fact that it was often tied into an arms industry, and the same mechanisms were being used to produce these sort of weapons of mass destruction. So again, two 21st century technologies, 20th century technologies rather, two 20th century technologies that were adopted in different ways. The car just spread like the internal combustion engine, spread like wildfire. Everybody adopted it. Massive social effect. Nuclear, where people did actually call a halt quite soon after it was developed as a technology, it wasn't allowed to spread like wildfire. It was very, very closely managed and remains closely managed to this day.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because those are examples that are often cited. I do think that nuclear had an enormous impact on our understanding of technology as such. Suddenly it was a pivotal point in human history where we suddenly were able to develop a technology that could end us. permanently. And I remember, I mean, a lot of the technology criticism that we see today actually has its roots in technology criticism that was written in the shadow of the mushroom clouds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think if you look at a guy like Jacques Ellul, for example, who is one of these great technology critics, he sort of starts from a position of this is stuff that humans should not be involved with because we are making ourselves into either machines or into gods, and neither is conducive to a healthy civilization. That's nuclear technology talking. That's sort of the kind of technology criticism that grew from, I think, the Second World War use of atomic weapons. So there's a lot in there, but there's also a lot of differences, of course, between nuclear technology and information technology. Not least the fact that nuclear technology can be controlled in a way that information technology cannot, because it's sort of dependent on certain very difficult to get raw materials, and you have to work with those in order to get them into a place where they're useful, etc. But I think that the sort of we should never forget when we analyze the tech-lash that there's actually a connection back to every kind of technology that people have become afraid of or disappointed in before. And so understanding the debate around nuclear technology and the first wave of techno-skepticism that comes after the First World War is really essential in order to understand, for example, the writings of Shoshana Zuboff. It is one of the explanations, I think, for why critics never feel that they're obliged to give alternatives, because it's sort of if you're criticizing a technology like the atom bomb, you're not going to say, I think we should have a smaller atom bomb, or I think we should use atom bombs only over here. It's just, you can just criticize the technology without providing any kind of optionality around what to do instead. And that has persisted in what I think is a less constructive way in a lot of the techno criticism that we have today. On the car example, I think the car example is interesting in a couple of different ways, but I think it's interesting actually because one of the models I see popping up more and more in critical literature is this notion of externalities. And so when you look at a car, it has clear externalities in terms of its environmental damage and sort of its pollution. And there are a lot of people now comparing misinformation to pollution and saying that just as we tax polluters, we should tax people who enable fake news and misinformation. The notion being that this is sort of destroying some kind of commons in the same way that the car pollution destroyed the environment. And so what happened there historically and philosophically was the construction of this notion of the environment as something that we should all own, protect, and we didn't have this idea of the environment before as crisply, and it's been chronicled by many different people who write in the history of ideas. I wonder what it is that we're sort of developing now as this protective thing that we don't want technology to erode, that is to the information technology as the environment was to the car, as pollution was to the car. What's the sort of common thing, the thing that we're trying to protect? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes up most frequently is sort of politics and the political sphere. So in a way, in a sense, the democratic environment is the thing that I think people see as being fundamentally threatened in the same way that a polluting car. So if we want to extend this analogy, I love to extend my analogy, but the polluting car was destroying the natural environment. It was very attractive. It produced all sorts of benefits. But again, long term, we look at it and go, "Oh, crikey, should we have allowed that to happen?" And I think that I get echoes of that in what people are saying about the information space online. Back to that quote I made earlier, as long as this stuff is circulating, can you have a true functioning democracy? So I think there's almost a sense that the political environment, the democratic environment, is fundamentally threatened by the pollution of certain forms of information. And leading to the view of, again, it's interesting, are these things so fundamentally incompatible? And if they're fundamentally incompatible, you've got to choose one or the other. Which one are you going to plump for? Do you want the technology at risk? And again, I'm perhaps more optimistic about democratic structures. I don't think they necessarily continue in the same way forever, but they will find a way to evolve. That's probably where I'm coming from. Says they evolve into a different form of democratic structure than before. It's got to work differently. By which I mean things like the central points of control, the political parties. That there's a whole sort of machinery of democracy that we're used to. You can undo that machinery and replace it with something else and still be democratic, just differently democratic. Whereas
Yeah.
I think for some of the critics, they would say, the political environment sort of depends on that machinery being in place. If the technology threatens it, then the machinery breaks. Once the machinery is broken, the democracy is broken. So perhaps that's the bit to zero in on. I think it is to take that car analogy, it's the political environment being threatened by this new technology. And the way that sort of manifests itself is that the machinery of politics that we've been used to is being broken
Mm.
by the way in which the more open, more subversive internet platforms work.
It's such a rich analogy, and there's so much you could do with it. I mean, if you're a technology professional and you want to understand partly how this works out, then you can also understand the dynamics of it. And it sort of makes me think that if you go back to the 70s when the entire environmental debate started, and we had our sort of first glimpses of what environmental activism looked like, etc., you had a couple of key moments and I think key texts that influenced that time. And you had this book called The Limits to Growth, that was essentially saying that you can't have economic growth because the environment will go away, and sort of criticizing industrialism, the use of cars, the use of airplanes, all that stuff, was essentially saying this technological progress is stopping social progress. Again, decoupling the two. There's a really strong set of examples of this in the 70s where sort of exactly the same thing happens. And I think it's really interesting to think about what is the limits of growth for information technology, which is that what kinds of books are we seeing now that we will look back at as we look back at limits of growth now? We see limits of growth as a useful, I think, clarion call, but also as sort of a perhaps overly pessimistic view of what mankind would be able to do. So is there, and there's hope in that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably two sections of the tech sector where I think these questions will be particularly relevant this year. I'm not convinced that we're going to roll back in terms of information sharing, so social media type stuff. I mean, people sharing different forms of content, video content, all of this sort of stuff. In a sense, that's not completely revolutionary. It's stuff that we did before. We're just doing it. More of us are doing it more cheaply than ever before, and we're sharing different stuff from before. But there are two sort of potential revolutions I think happening right now. One is around finance, uh, where all of these discussions that we've talked a little bit about before, but these conversations around cryptocurrencies and things like that's a true revolution in the sense that could end up creating an utterly different structure for the way in which money works from the structure that existed before. Could do, might not. But I think that's one of the areas where people will be asking rightly this question of, is that technology going too far? Do we want to be dependent on a technology perhaps that we don't even fully understand for something that's so fundamental to our livelihoods, literally to our livelihoods, as the money in our pockets? So there'll be a whole sort of questions there. And then I think the second one is this metaverse question, which, and again, this week's news, you saw Microsoft paying huge amounts of money for Activision, the gaming company, and that sort of predicate on the fact that they want a piece of this metaverse thing that the company formerly known as Facebook has staked its claim to by rebranding itself with the word meta and all this. So I think the other area that is truly revolutionary is this sort of open question about whether we are going to not spend time on the internet, but in the internet. Are we all going to shift into an environment in which we, almost literally, you don't go physically on holiday, you have a holiday from your bedroom in your head, as it were? And that's the sort of premise of the metaverse, is that you're substituting sort of physical interaction for online interaction in a much more profound way than I think is true today. So those are the two areas where I'd say really interesting questions, I think, right now of, do we want to limit the technology? In the case of the money bit, I actually think that's largely a government decision, because governments control existing mechanisms of money. And so does government want to allow that to evolve, the technology to evolve, or is government going to put a rein on it? The metaverse one, I think, actually is much more about consumers. It's about us as humans, whether we end up wanting to go there, as obviously the technology companies are betting we will, or whether we will perhaps taste it and not like it and want to come back from it. But there's perhaps two areas where I think that big question, is it too far, are being asked. I think the other ones, I say the sort of video and social media and stuff like that. This year's a year when we're expecting it to be regulated, but I don't think we're turning it off, or I think what we're doing is kind of placing it within a more orderly framework.
Yeah, yeah. No, and it raises another interesting question. I think those are two really good examples of new uses of technology that are not necessarily being held back by the tech-lash. I mean, you could argue, and I read an article to this effect some months back that I thought was quite interesting. There's you talk about the tech-lash everywhere in news media and in policy circles, but you see it nowhere in technology usage statistics.
Yeah.
So there's no one who stops using their computers, no one who stops buying a phone. So what does that mean? There's no real statistical evidence of less usage of technology. You could probably not even find massive changes in usage patterns that people go from one service to another because it's designed in a. I mean, I don't think that you're seeing tons of fewer people use social media, for example. I think you see a constant pickup of social media across the board. So it's this weird phenomenon where you sort of you know that there's the techlash feels real, right? We have this debate, we have this discussion, we have this ongoing examination of the externalities of technology, really digging into it, but we're changing nothing that we do. And in fact, we're using technology more and more, and we're developing deeper and deeper. And even if I mean, even if you were to say to me, yes, but Web3, which seems to be something people say to me a lot these days, I would say, well, perhaps, but it's such a minor, marginal phenomenon right now that I'm not entirely sure that that counts as an index of techlash. So,
Yeah.
what's going on here?
Yeah, so I think there are two possible. There are sort of two variants to the tech-lash bit. So if tech-lash says, "Oh, I think there's a problem here," um, and X needs to be done, but X could be, and we need to hold the technology back. And I think that may be relevant for things like some of the financial instrument developments. Actually, for AI is another area where a view may be taken that certain areas should just not be developed in terms of AI, that there may be a decision to hold back. So that's sort of one variant, which is let's hold the technology back. The other one is there's a problem here, and the solution is for us to control this thing more. And so, I think the areas you said that are still growth areas, I'm not sure anyone is seriously contemplating turning off social media or turning off video platforms or stopping the online retailers from doing their stuff. What they are saying is, we want to control this, and we want a piece of the action. There may be some at the margins who say, look, the answer is to get rid of the Amazons and things like that. But actually, I think it's more mainstream to be saying, no, what we need to do is to make sure Amazon makes the same contribution that a traditional retailer would have made to society, that we need to have more controls over how these large e-commerce platforms work. We're not going to turn them off, and not least because, as you point out, with their voters and electorates, that's not going to be the most popular option in the world. An interesting one where we've perhaps seen this play out was the whole Uber debate, where Uber was at the sharp end of revolutionizing, from their point of view, the way in which taxi ride-hailing services work. And we've actually seen a lot of efforts to kind of hold them back. They've generally stayed in the market, but they've been brought more and more into a framework where they're required, for example, to give, in the UK now, they have to give their drivers employee rights. They're sort of brought into the system. They're brought into the framework rather than being stopped altogether. So maybe that's the Uber model is quite an interesting one to see. A scenario where there was a really concerted effort to push back, and it's moved from, in most cases, let's stop this, to let's build it into a framework where it's more on an even footing, a level footing with other existing providers.
Yeah, and then I think you point to something interesting, and that is that even if usage is increasing, and even if you see more and more people using the existing services and the existing technology, which seems to indicate that there is not an acute tech-lash against the technology we have, there's a question about the technology we could get,
Yeah.
the technology we could develop, and that brings us to one of the arguments that both you and I have been guilty of of I think articulating, and that is that many a time when somebody has suggested a regulation that I thought was less helpful, I have been known to say things like, but that will harm innovation.
Yes.
And it's so interesting to me to study how that argument has evolved over time. There used to be a time, back in the 90s where you could say that will harm innovation, and people go like, oh, okay, you're right. We should
Yeah.
rethink this. If you say now this will harm innovation, people will go like, how much?
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
And it's like I mean, what it's so interesting. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to money. I think, in the sense that when you are arguing successfully to say this will harm innovation, and people went, "Oh, I better be careful." I think there was an underlying assumption that the innovation would be good for your country, both good for sort of individual wealth and also for government wealth. That innovation means more tax revenue and more personal income, and we want to be at the forefront of innovation was the view. So yes, you go in as a policy person and go, do you want Britain to be the most innovative place in the world? Of course we do, because innovation means money. And now, when you go in and say innovation, a lot of them are thinking, "Oh, you mean so that," and say in particular, American companies can suck more of the wealth out of my country, whilst providing very little in terms of return. Not just not providing return, but damaging businesses that already exist. And so again, the e-commerce one would be an example, which I actually think is misplaced, because a lot of the investment and is in the countries, and actually a lot of those e-commerce providers are taking very small margins, and by taking smaller margins than the people that they've replaced, they are actually leaving more money in people's pockets. But it doesn't feel like that. What it feels like is, that this innovative business has come in, and my people are poorer and my government is poorer. And so the tax thing is critical, where the companies are headquartered is critical, and who the winners and losers are is seen as critical. So maybe that's really what it boils down to, that innovation is fine as long as you're the winners from the innovation. And if you perceive yourself as being a loser from the innovation at a national level as a policymaker, then you're going to resist it. And that's, I think,
Yeah.
the primary money. Money is often at the root of these debates, but in quite a kind of meaningful way. It's about whether or not you're going to benefit from that innovation, or whether others are going to benefit from it.
I also think that there's like a conceptual shift here, because I remember reading The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen late in the 19s, and thinking this is really important. Disruptive innovation is key to understanding how technology markets work. And there were all of these quotes from famous tech gurus. I think Apple Steve Jobs said that of course I'm going to disrupt myself so that nobody else disrupt my business, when he noted that the iPhone would disrupt the business of the iPod, but he was fine with that because otherwise somebody else would come along and eat his lunch. Disruptive innovation was sort of really hailed as a positive word. If you say disruptive innovation today, you're almost I think you're pretty much exactly identifying the kind of innovation people don't want. They don't want innovation that rocks the boat. But that's the nature of innovation, right? Nature
Yeah.
of innovation is that it is it sounds great because it's innovation, it's like new things happening. But it is really, if you look at it more closely with an economic lens, it's closely related to and flows from Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. Something needs to be destroyed for something new to take its place. And that sort of brutal truth about innovation is something that I think more and more people are uncomfortable with. And I think also that that's fascinating, because it then leads to an actual question about the sort of the patterns, the effects, the impacts of the tech-lash. Do we believe that innovation has slowed down as an effect of the change in the way that people view technological progress?
I mean, I'm not sure it's slowed down. I don't see people sort of being less inventive. But I think the patterns are changing as to where they are. I remember criticism, when when the companies like the ones that you and I used to work for, the Googles and the Facebooks were arose, that there'll be criticism that you take the world's greatest brains and the best engineers, and you set them to work figuring out how you can get someone to click on an advertisement. The fact that was
Ouch.
yeah, but in a sense, it was true that the companies had the deepest pockets and they could do the most innovative stuff. And I think to a certain extent, like that, we shouldn't be looking for innovation in the same space. Some of these things are built now. E-commerce platforms, resource sharing platforms, social media platforms. Those are kind of built. So I think the pace is going to slow, sort of necessarily, because you've got all the building blocks in place. A bit like when you develop something like the automobile in the first sort of few years, you're coming up with wildly different designs. At a certain point, you settle on a design that's got 4 wheels and a chassis like this, and now we're all going to build variants on that theme. So I think in terms of those, a lot of those core services, we're not seeing necessarily wild innovation, but in some of these other areas we are. And it may be less visible actually to the consumer right now where that innovation is happening. It's no surprise that things like crypto are bubbling at the moment. They're really hot. There's all sorts of stuff happening, and it does get badged up in all sorts of different ways. But I think we should be candid. There are people doing, some of the best brains are working in that space. AI is another one where, we're just in the foothills now. We're seeing what might come out of that. And these questions, some of the questions around how we would operate in these virtual spaces again. And again, I've said it before, there's no surprise that Meta or Facebook want to rebrand as Meta, because that is a space that where there is, I think, much more scope for innovation than there was in the, we run a website that shares information between people kind of space. So I think it would be a mistake to think the innovation's gone away, but I think it has gone out. I mean, if you just look at the established services, you'll see less of it, and where it is, maybe less visible.
But that's partly because of all of the these curves that everyone thought, sometimes myself included, were exponential curves, are really the kinds of curves that are called S curves, where they they flatten out at the end. And when you're at the end of the S curve, then you build another S curve on top of that, and that's more like how technological development works than that it's an eternal exponential curve. Past a Ray Kurzweil who believes that they're all exponentials.
Yeah.
But I think that it makes the question even more acute. Because if that's the case, innovation is not slowing down, we don't see any change in usage patterns, then it's really increasingly an enigma to me what is tech-lash then really affecting? Which brings me to a question. You used an analogy that I really liked in our last conversation on planning, where we talked about the importance of policy people being able to predict the weather, to have a sense of what the weather will actually be, and then within what they can say with their weather prediction, what they also would like to be able to do, and how you can prepare and bring an umbrella, and how you might want to plan your party when it's sunny and not raining, and there's all kinds of things like that. But you have to get a sense of the weather, which is the sort of the political changes happening on the ground in parliament being debated. But there's like a distinction here between weather and climate. And to a certain extent, it feels like the tech-lash is more of a climate thing. So as a policy person, how would you predict the climate in the debate? Do you think the tech-lash is worsening, or is it like is this a global tech-lash scenario where it's all going to be +2 degrees? And
So
how does that work?
I actually wonder if tech-lash isn't actually weather, and climate is still moving firmly in the direction of technology. And again, this week, the Microsoft Activision takeover, there's quite a lot of commentary going, isn't it extraordinary that Microsoft, which was the evil empire that had to be, there was a tech-lash against Microsoft way back when, and it had to sort of have its wings clipped. And now, 20 odd years on, 25 years on, it's seen as a sort of stable pillar of American industry. It's worth an absolute fortune, more than all the Googles and Facebooks. I think Apple is the only company that's worth more than it in this space. And again, another old company. So these old companies, Apple and Microsoft, that started up in the 70s, are now super well established, actually quite uncontroversial, worth a lot of money, and delivering a lot of the technology that we use every day. And I mean, that's the climate. That tells me that the climate has been pretty favorable towards technology. And so if I had to make a bet, it would be that this is a storm, the current tech-lash against the online services, the Google's Meta's type stuff, it is more of a storm, and that the long-term climate says, as long as they play their cards right, they'll end up like Microsoft. They'll be delivering services, they'll be boring. I mean, Microsoft went through a phase where it was evil, and then it went through a phase where it was sort of boring and kicked around a little bit, and reputationally not at all seen as a hot property. So I think they might get into a boring phase. But do I think that we're not going to be using a lot of this technology that these companies deliver in 20 years' time? No. I think that they will be there. So the tech-lash is a moment rather than, I think, representing a long-term trend in terms of those established technologies, shall I say, which are the ones that have attracted attention, and content, e-commerce, all of those kind of established things. Maybe a different set of questions to say for some of the new technologies that are still in gestation right now.
Yeah, so a storm that you can weather, and on the other side of that storm, you're going to come out, and if you play your cards right, you will be boring but profitable.
Yeah,
It's an interesting. I mean, there's a lot of truth to that life cycle, right? There are ways that you can get through this. I think we talked sometime a long time ago about the life cycle of a technology company, which is that it starts with this honeymoon of the entrepreneur when it's cute and cuddly and everyone wants to be with it. Then it goes into the long dark night of antitrust, which is this period where it's searching for its soul and everyone's trying to understand what it is, and it's really wandering in the desert. And after that, it can sort of evolve in two different ways. It can either die into the thermodynamic heat death of consultancy, where it
yeah,
just adds more and more people and margins shrink, or it can be a persistent innovator like Microsoft or Intel. I think is another example of a persistent innovator that continues to innovate and just continues to grow, but it's passed through some kind of crucible, some kind of test, almost a social test that then allows us to just sort of go on. Should we see the tech-lash as a sort of a rite of passage for
yeah.
this industry, for this wave of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said earlier that it's posed some useful and challenging questions. So I think part of the rite of passage, those questions are posed. It's a sort of reset moment from the will sort of grow at any pace. The famous move fast and break things will just kind of grow at any pace. There's this reset moment where they've got to start behaving sort of more corporate and more traditionally corporately. There's a reset moment on things like taxes, which you discussed elsewhere. All of these sort of things. There's going to be a reset moment in terms of responsibility for content standards. The content standards, I'm not sure, are going to fundamentally change, but they will be owned by government regulators, or there'll be shared ownership between platforms and government regulators rather than, sole ownership of the standards by platforms that has been today. So a whole bunch of sort of reset things that will take place. There may be. I certainly think they're going to be prevented from acquiring much more. There's still an open question about whether services are actually going to be broken up, but certainly they're going to have to consolidate because acquisitions are going to get harder and harder for them because they get more and more scrutiny over them. So I think that's the phase we're going through. It is a coming of age moment, going from awkward teenager. Maybe they've grown out of that already. Awkward teenager into their sort of university years, where they're still a bit wild, into kind of sedate middle age. So there's a sort of it's not your bar mitzvah. It's not your like teenage rite of passage. It's a 20-something rite of passage where you're going into the big bad world of family and work and more sedate activities. So I think that's
I,
where they
and I,
are.
I love that point because I do remember. I mean, amongst the most sort of not well, I guess amongst the most difficult years that I remember in my life personally were the years between when you had started at university and done 1 or 2 years, and then you weren't really sure what to do. So between 22 and say 25, you were really lost
Yeah.
in the sense that you were sort of, who am I, where am I, what is this, what should I be doing with my life, kind of thing. And that does seem to resonate with this whole entire tech-lash thing. But it raises another interesting question that I think a lot of policy people face, and that is, okay, so we have this tech-lash that's not affecting usage, not slowing down innovation, but it is a moment for us to reflect, and it is this moment where it's sort of a way to find ourselves. We're sort of long dark night of the soul is also about identifying your own beliefs, right? So it is that. How do you deal with the rest of the internal stakeholders in a company when they read this enormously scathing article about what you're doing as a company, or they go to you and say, we have to respond to this, we have to push back, etc. What you're saying is sort of, no, quietly lean into this, get out on the other side, and become boring and corporate, because that's the way to success. Do not prolong this period when you're wandering into the desert and living on student loans. For God's sake, man, get a job and get a haircut and shape up and sort of. So how should policy people think about communicating the tech-lash internally to their stakeholders, who are going to feel attacked and upset and feel that this is not an accurate reflection of who we are?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is be more boring. You put your finger on it. And actually, there's a really interesting sort of laboratory for this right now in China, where the government have said to their tech companies, we insist that you're boring, and you've even got to go and take some of your chief executives and sort of park them in a box somewhere and not allow them to speak because they're too interesting and they're too much of a personality. So there's a sort of, in China, there's a government mandated attempt to make tech companies boring. I think in the US, it's more of a market and activist driven, or particularly activist sort of driven attempt to make tech companies become more boring. But I think that is the answer. That's where they're going to go. It's interesting, again, in terms of personalities, that and now Meta is a kind of pretty much an exception in terms of still having its very sort of high profile, big name CEO or founder as the CEO, whereas we've even seen Twitter turnover now. And you actually stop a member of the public in the street and you say, who are the CEOs of Google and Twitter and Microsoft, and they'll probably get all three names wrong. They're going to say to you, if they know Larry Page and Bill Gates and Sergey Brin and Jack Dorsey, if they are following the tech companies, they're not going to sort of name the current CEOs. So it's really interesting that part of that sort of boringness is about tamping everything down and becoming less interesting. So I think that's where we're going. I'm not sure that's going to wash with people inside the company to say you get rid of your high profile CEO. Well, that's not kind of what I'm arguing for, but it's
I love that, though. It's a great argument to try to make. I mean, if you should be brave.
Oh yeah, I don't wear
Yes.
that, so it's fine. I can say,
Yes, yes.
but there's something about the dullness, and it's things like not picking fights. So again, interestingly, I've looked at this with we've been in these situations where something blows up and there's policy people. Well, your first instinct is, as a company, it's not just the policy people at the sharp end of a company that wants to pick a fight. Whereas, the boring version is to say, okay, you said jump, which way do you want me to jump? How high do you want me to jump? But I'll jump, not like jumping. That's stupid. Why am I jumping? And actually, I've noticed this in again, particularly you look at the way some of the Chinese companies operate, and again, I think it reflects their own local environment. They are much more inclined, if the government says, I want you to do X, they're more inclined to say, fine. Like, we're not going to make a fuss. We're not going to fight it. Whereas there was something, I think, particularly strongly in the Silicon Valley culture that said, we're going to fight. And I think that, that's when you see a company decide to become boring. Microsoft went from, and again, younger listeners will not remember this, but Bill Gates was sitting in the hot seat in congressional committees, and they were the ones, who were fighting back desperately against the government. And they changed, I'm not going to say overnight, because there was a process for change for them, and they had the scars as well. But at a certain point, they changed to being the servant of government, if you can describe it that way. And all of their stance, their approach is,
Their
government, what do you
UN
want? What do you need?
presence, the work they do. I think, and I think that also actually points back to something you mentioned before when you talked about the car. If you look at, how did the companies of that time, the car companies, the oil companies, the energy companies, deal with the green revolution and the activism and the sort of, let's call it the car backlash, or the
Yeah.
oil backlash? Well, the answer is really interesting. I think that a lot of what they did was to be boring, and they asked a really good question: is how are you best boring? And the answer to that question is you need to find an external yardstick that you can all agree to and a standard you can adhere to. And what you end up with is this profoundly demoralizing world in which what a policy team does is that it takes first page issues that are plaguing the company and turns them into investor relation page checklists.
Mm.
If you can do that, if you can sort of take your first page issues and turn them into a question of compliance, then at
Yes.
that point you've succeeded in handling your political challenges and you can go forth, be boring and profitable, and continue to be a persistent innovator. So this notion of a policy team as a mechanism that produces investor relation checklists out of first page issues is sort of exaggerated, of course, but there's some truth to that, and it points to a really sort of interesting follow-up question to you is what are the mechanisms of being boring? Not picking a fight
Yeah.
is one, seeking a standard or an external yardstick is another. How are
Yeah.
you best boring?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, to that point, this external yardstick thing, I think, is important. You shift from defending what you see to be the interests of the internet, your sector, to defending the interests of your company. And so, if in
Hmm.
the early days, people would see themselves as champions of the internet. The internet must be free. Government must have hands off. We've talked about the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace as a whole. You filthy governments, keep your hands off our thing. You move from that to saying, well, what's in the interest of my company? Well, what's in the interest of my company is that all of us are regulated in the same way in the internet sector. So we kind of now almost don't worry too much whether you regulate the internet a lot or a little or in blue or in pink. As long as everybody has to be blue or pink, then my company can be fine, and then we'll think about how we're positioned against the other people in the sector. But we're not defending the internet, we're defending Meta or Google or whoever, and which is quite a different, I think, sort of approach and quite a different psychology. And that's where it, in a sense, sort of gets boring to an extent, because we're now not picking fights of principle. We're looking at like the mechanics of jockeying for position in a market. When you bring in this particular regulation, are the compliance costs for me disproportionate to the compliance costs for everyone else? And then a lot of your argumentation is make sure everyone has the same compliance costs. So you want, in the automotive sector, when they bring in an emissions regulation, it's like, fine, and we'll all stick catalytic converters on. But I just want to make sure that nobody else, none of my competitors, gets away with not putting the catalytic converter on, and then we're all going to be okay. So it's
Mm.
that, I think, it's quite a profound shift actually from sort of thinking of yourself as a champion for a particular technology and making government, pushing back on government to keep their hands off that technology as a class, with your company as one representative of it, to think of yourself as defending your company, their position in the market. And in that case, just as you described it, it then becomes much more about what are our compliance costs relative to everyone else, what's our position in the market relative to everyone else, rather than here's a big issue of principle that I'm going to stand on, where I think government shouldn't, be regulating us at all.
And ties back to the conversation we had about how really vital and vibrating farmers markets turn into pharma markets, right? So
Yes.
the end question at that sort of chain of reasoning is, of course, if we all have the same compliance cost, is there a way that I can help my country turn those compliance costs into entry barriers in better ways than the others? And so you build this structure where you have a core of a few companies and then a wide set sort of sphere outside of the core of smaller innovative companies that are bought or licensed when they come up with something, because they can't get into the core because of the entry barriers in the shape of compliance costs. It sort of ties together, that model ties together. But I sort of feel that we're now on the sort of dark side of the forest, saying that you should turn first page issues into checklists on your investor relations page, and you should make sure that everyone has to suffer the same level of pain. And then you should take that pain and you should nurse that pain and make it into an entry barrier that makes it impossible for anyone else to. That's a very, we should give me optimism, Richard. I
Yeah.
want to feel good about about our craft.
Uh,
How
yeah, I think well. So I just think, again, I mean, almost literally, if the question is, how can you advance the interests of a particular company in the market in the context of all of this tech-lash, everything going on. I think honestly that is the right strategy. Now, for you as an individual, if you're interested in the internet more broadly, and I hope you are if you've gone to work for a tech company, I think there are plenty of other opportunities to debate these things, and they're not closed issues. I think, in a sense, it's almost you're moving it from being a kind of industry-led debate. You're moving into space where it's a politically led debate. And so, again, I'm almost arguing to say, look, you can debate the issues of principle, but you're going to debate them in a different context. And that context is going to be the classic battle of ideas between political parties in a country, as opposed to it being something between tech companies and the government. Is going to shift into the debate between the political forces in a country. And I think there's plenty more mileage there to our, where we started the discussion around things like innovation. I think there is a political debate for a country about the extent to which it is going to take risks in the name of innovation, the extent to which it is going to welcome creative destruction, perhaps, of its old industries. I just don't think that the tech companies themselves are going to have a particularly big voice in that debate. So maybe that's the debates are happening. It's just that tech companies are not necessarily entitled to the same amount of voice as they used to have, I think, in these discussions. I don't know if
Maybe
that's
they
cheerful or
can.
not.
Yeah, kind of. I have to be honest, but I think there's also this notion that if you're the object of the debate, you're going to be much less powerful than if you're a participant in the debate. And perhaps you can be a participant in the debate if you move into being as boring as possible, so you're no longer the object of the debate, and then you will be able to change things. I mean, I'd give kudos to the Microsoft folks, because I think they've been quite good at that transition into discussing big and important things that have to do with international treaties on law enforcement access, etc. So there's at least some hope in being able to more freely participate in the discussion when you're not the object of it.
Yeah. So here we are, the former representatives of these cutting edge internet industries, concluding our discussion on innovation and everything that means by saying, perhaps we're all going to be Microsoft, and that's a good thing.
And on that note, well, I sort of think that they're a clever bunch. Anyway, so you can find this podcast on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
And you will hear more from us in our next episode, so stay tuned. And thank you so much for listening. Keep your ideas, your comments, your questions coming, and we will certainly pick up any subject that you think is interesting. Thank you so much for listening.